Yeah, on.
Two twins. Yes, yes, and yes. Episode 26. Two twins and an album. Yes, yes. T, how we doing today?
That kind of reminds me of the old Yes, Michigan campaign. Remember that? Yes, Michigan. These states do these like goofy campaigns. I don't know if they're trying to get people to visit or whatever. But this one, was this probably in the 80s?
Yeah, that would be like probably mid to late 80s. Yeah.
It was just, yes, Michigan. Both with exclamation points.
I remember they had a song. It was something like, yes, Michigan, the feeling is dead. Something like that. Do you remember that? The Yes, Michigan song?
I think I do actually now that you mentioned it. Now that you gave that rendition, I think it does. Yeah.
They'd play that commercial in between Channel 7 newscasts with the great Bill Bonds.
Yeah. And then they went to the now sort of modern version of this is pure Michigan, so which I don't like as much. I like yes, a little Marv Albert in there. Yes, Michigan. Yes.
Well, there's something painfully simple about it, right? Just yes, Michigan. I mean,
it's kind of random and simple and kind of sort of dumb, but great all at the same time.
We'll talk a little bit about simple monikers tonight, won't we? With this evening's selection. I mean, the title of this album is as painfully simple as Yes, Michigan, right?
I guess one of the few things simple about tonight's band, indeed. But I will say from the onset, apologies in advance. I have been a little under the weather here for the last week or so. So if you get a voice crack or whatever it might be from me, my apologies in advance. I don't think I have the Rona. I've gotten tested a couple times, but I guess still kind of TBD on that one. But just a shout out to being sick, which is just wonderful. What a great way to cap out 2020. Been a great year with just lots of positive vibes and such. And I figured there'd be no better way to wrap it up than to just, be basically bedridden for a few days. So that's
sort of the only way to end this particular year, right? But I will tell you though, it's your dedication to Two Twins and an Album is astounding. I mean, here you are, little shade under the weather, and here you are ready to contribute thoughts to this wonderful podcast.
Well, and listen, I mean, you gave me such a warm, simple, feel good type piece of musicality to really help me through these last few days. Because, when you're sick, obviously, having something nice and soothing is so props to you certainly for providing that as tonight's featured album. There's really nothing that really soothes me quite like what you decided upon this week. So thanks again for that.
As all of our listeners know, we do not excel in the world of preparation for this podcast. In fact, we don't prepare at all. The only preparation that might be considered prep for this show was a few days ago. I did check in with T, as we always do, as we sort of, think about which album we're going to do. And I did make the statement, something to the extent of, this is probably not the best album to listen to when you're sick. This is an album that might send somebody into some sort of illness, whether it be physical or mental, but an interesting choice for one fighting some sort of illness.
Well, it definitely, it's funny. I had a great conversation with one of our listeners just yesterday, actually, Sam F, great guy, avid listener of the podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and all those type of things. He's a great listener of ours, and he's thinking about getting into podcasting, and we were talking a bit about, he was kind of asking what our preparation is. And as much as I wanted to pretend like there was a big grand plan every episode and every week, pretty much had to break it to him that that there's very little, But I'll say this about tonight's selection, regardless of kind of being sick and it maybe not being an ideal selection in that way, it definitely kept my brain working, So guess I had that going for me,
which is nice. Do you mind if I kick off the show with a written statement? I have something prepared. Is that okay? Can I do a written statement?
Well, I just got done saying how grossly unprepared we generally are. Now you're telling me that you have concocted an official statement to kick things off. I mean,
oh, believe me, I did not concoct this. That would you're going to get a few words in and say, "Oh, no way, Nubs wrote this."
Well, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, here we go. This is a written statement to kick off episode 26. In the galactic reaches, the luminescence of planetary spheres, far-flung nebulas, and distant orbs shine bright. Yet perception can grow dim as the atmosphere thickens. Appropriately, the sun is the one universal constant. Vibrantly red, it luxuriates in all of its mercurial splendor. Red has always been the most intriguing, awe-inspiring, and mysterious of the primary colors.
Jeez. Who knew?
As we've talked about previously in the podcast, I covered music and therefore was sent hundreds of press releases a year for albums. None that read quite like that. What it is, that's the first paragraph of the official Atlantic Records press release for the album Red in 1974. That's how probably some intern from a PR office in New York for Atlantic decided to capture the attention of press when it came to this album. And little did that person know whether it would have been a high-level PR professional or a low-level person just doing what they were asked to do. They probably didn't realize that the music world was not going to have to work particularly hard to get critics to pay attention to this album, were they?
Tell you, back when albums were a profitable piece of commerce, back in the good old days, when you had press releases going out for records, trying to move units, I kind of long for those days in a way, but that's interesting.
Definitely long for those days. I think what's interesting too, and I'll talk a little bit more about, how I scored this particular artifact. It's basically 2 paragraphs long. And I read you essentially the first paragraph. That paragraph ends with distinctively Red is the title of King Crimson's newest album on Atlantic Records. And the British group lights up all horizons with its volatile music. And I think the word volatile is something that we're definitely going to have to revisit as you move forward here. So let's do that. But before we get into the volatility of this beloved album, let's see how volatile your ears have been lately by looking at what is spinning round and round for you, T. Let's do it round and round. See, what albums have been suiting your fancy as of late?
Well, one group that we have focused on in an episode here on the old podcast, and that is The Doors. However, the album that we did had Jim. This album is Sans Jim, and it's called Full Circle. And I know that we talked about it a little bit on that episode, and you had mentioned it's one that actually both records that they did without Jim were quite good. And I've since, checked out Full Circle, and it's great. I mean, it's great. It's musically some of the best stuff that they did. And, Ray's voice is really good and unique and, really good fit for that music. That's something I've definitely been checking into lately. Second is an album called The Last in Line. And this is by
yes.
great RJ Dio, which obviously kicks off in pretty impeccable fashion with We Rock, which is just a strong Dio track. And the third is by the Lassie Foundation. and one of my favorite bands, sort of a spin-off of the Prayer Chain out of Southern California, and led by Wayne Everett and Eric Campazano primarily. And this is their California EP, which was their debut, and leads off with a beautiful track, one of my favorite songs of all time, called I Can Be Her Man. So, and then they went on to actually have quite a great catalog, over a span of a couple decades, so this kind of gives you the real beginning of Lassie Foundation back in this had to be around the mid to late 90s, I would think. So check out California EP by those guys. And that is what is Round and Round for me. What do you got, Nub?
Those are some very tasty choices, as always. I like that you went from Obscure Doors to Dio to the Lassie Foundation. Those are some quantum leaps you took there, T. I love it. The first one for me would be the Peter Gabriel album, Us. This is the 1992 album, and this album always stands out to me just because of the context of when it came out. Grunge was really starting to take over the musical world, but there was all this like non-grunge music as well. If you weren't listening to Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Nirvana, there was still so much out there that was happening that had nothing to do with grunge. And I remember this album kind of being something that stood out in that way. And the music videos that Gabriel was putting out at this time were just incredible. I think of the Digging in the Dirt video and the Kiss That Frog video, and Steam was a great single. And so, Us is, I think, just one of those albums that probably should be heralded a little bit more, but just came out at such a unique time for music. So that was a 1982 effort. Second would be the Peter Gabriel album, Up. This is from 2002. So, he had this run of albums with two letters in the song title, So, then Us, then Up. And Up really is his last full-length album in terms of studio material. It's just spectacular. It's kind of darker and a little moodier. It took him just forever to make. Such a perfectionist. But top to bottom, it's right up there with my favorite Gabriel albums. And, listening to Us kind of led to listening to Up. And so those have been great albums to rediscover here near the end of this rather insane year that we've all lived through. And then lastly, I'm currently in the middle of reading Steve Lukather's autobiography, which is called The Gospel According to Luke. Have you read it yet, T?
It's great. Yeah, I'm about 3/4 through it. It's awesome. Actually, have you checked out the audio version?
I'm actually listening to the audio.
It's sweet. I mean, he's so good at the storytelling piece, and he's got such a good delivery and all that. So yeah, I'm about 3/4 of the way through the audio. It's one of those where, I'm all for the visual reading of books and everything, but it's one of those where the audio version is probably better, where you can really capture things in his voice.
No doubt. His delivery it's like he's sitting in the room with you. It's very conversational and super authentic. And that's a pretty cool thing. So, falling in between, the album from 2006, this is sort of the comeback album, and it had the title track, which is a really amazing song. I think we've talked about that one before on What's in Your Head. But a really strong album. This is sort of the return of the Bobby Kimball lineup and, David Paich, and sort of got the band back together as much as they could at this time. And we saw them on this tour at least once, maybe a couple times. And they were firing on pretty good cylinders at this point. But of course, in typical Toto fashion, the whole thing fell apart and they changed lineups once again. So changing lineups is certainly a big part of the Toto story, but falling in between rounds out Round and Round for me. So speaking of changing lineups, that is a significant part of the King Crimson story. There is just no possible way we could even scratch the surface of this band and their now 50 plus years of existence. But tonight's album, stands out in a number of ways from the rest of the Crimson catalog, but more than anything, maybe just simply for its lineup and the uniqueness of the trio formation that led to this particular record. So with all that in mind, let's jump into a little bit of the King Crimson story. Not the whole story. We'd be here for 5 hours, but we'll scratch the surface as much as possible as we get into Red with the Nerdy Deets, and they are done dirt cheap.
You want some dirty deeds? Yeah. You want some dirty deeds?
Red. I just like that title. We'll talk more about it. Is the 7th studio album by King Crimson. It was released on October the 6th of 1974. It was on Island Records in the United Kingdom, and as referenced earlier in the reading of the press release, on Atlantic Records in both North America and Japan. Recorded in London, produced by the band, of course. There was no way the band was going to bring in and welcome an outside producer. That's just not really how the Crims roll. Obviously, Robert Fripp kind of being the one who drives the ship. The album checks in at a duration of 39 minutes and 54 seconds. So I think along with the 311 Blue album, this is the shortest album we've looked at, just purely in terms of duration. 5 tracks, 0 singles. T, is that a big surprise that none of these songs were considered hit singles?
Shocking, shocking. I really thought that Providence in particular was really made with a specific radio demographic in mind.
Yeah, great marketing tune on that one. Yeah. Obviously, we'll get into all of mighty 5 of these songs in the track by track. But I think what's most significant about Red is just the lineup. The first 2 albums for King Crimson, In the Court of the Crimson King and In the Wake of Poseidon, both featured a more sizable lineup of the band. It included Greg Lake, who went on to be part of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and other members who, for majorly differing reasons, left the band. And then they changed again, and there was some alterations to that lineup. That was the Larks, Tongues, and Aspic lineup. Actually, one guy from that lineup, Jamie Muir, he left to become a monk, if you can believe it. How King Crimson is that?
Like a real monk?
Yeah, like a legit monk.
Okay, it's a pretty classic career direction if you think about it. I mean, going from musician to monk, it's a pretty classic story. You hear it all the time.
It's a tale as old as time, isn't it? So for Red, which is sandwiched between Starless and Bible Black, which was the album that preceded it, and then it's the last King Crimson album until the big comeback with Adrian Belew, which was Discipline in 1981. So this did mark the end of an era for King Crimson. In fact, Fripp decided that he was going to disband the band almost during the recording and certainly right after it. He seemed to always have this plan for starting and stopping and restarting and all that kind of stuff. But this is the end of King Crimson in the 70s, and it's just 1974. And so,
how did the monk thing turn out for him, by the way? I mean, is he still a monk or?
It's a great question. I don't know if he's still a monk, like technically, but he did go through it, and he's a bizarre individual. I mean, he's a true eccentric, real artistic. I don't think he ever came back to music, but I know he went through with the monk thing, and he never came back to King Crimson. One element of Crimson is guys would leave and come back.
What's his name again?
Jamie Muir, Muir, and he was only on one Crimson album, The Larks, Tongues, and Aspic.
So it looks like just doing some quick research here. It looks like he monked for about 10 years, and then he returned to the London music scene in 1980. Played with a couple of pretty sweet looking bands, and then withdrew from the music business altogether around 1990 to. It says devote his energies to painting. So
there you go. All right.
Hey, it sounds kind of like with your focus on painting here lately, right?
That's right. You're a very busy painter to go along with us being very busy dancers.
Yeah. I'm still hoping to maybe see some of your work here. Maybe sometime during the holidays.
You would be so disappointed.
Kind of want to see what you're up to over there.
Yeah. And maybe one day. So with all this being said, Crimson was reduced to a trio. And that trio, of course, included the enigmatic and unforgettable Robert Fripp on all guitars and all things guitar, although his guitar rarely sounds like a guitar, although it certainly has its moments of doing so on Red. Oh, and it also needs to be said, Fripp played the mellotron too. So, the mellotron's an incredibly important instrument in the Crimson sound. And obviously on this album, the Mellotron is dominant. John Wetton on bass and vocals. He joined the band for Lark's Tongues and Aspic, and is a really, really important member of the King Crimson story. He was only in the band during this phase in the mid 70s, but created some of the most, kind of fabled works from the band, including a couple elements that we'll talk about on Red. And as listed in the press release and on the liner notes, William Bruford, not Bill Bruford, right? William Bruford. So, you get a King Crimson, you got to start doing things like using your full birth name, I suppose.
Yes, of course.
William Bruford on percussives, as they called it. Not to be confused with drums, but percussives. And then some guest artists, one of which isn't really a guest. Ian McDonald contributed saxophone. He was part of that initial lineup for King Crimson, and Mel Collins as well on saxophones as well. And then a couple other contributors on wind instruments. But Mel Collins, Ian McDonald, very, very, familiar names. Good luck trying to keep it all straight, but welcome to the world of King Crimson. All right, T. So I know you've been listening to King Crimson since you were like 6 years old, right? What kid hasn't? Right?
No question.
I want to hear your wonder story, though. Let's get into it. Let's do the wonder stories. T, when did you enter the court of the Crimson King?
Never.
Yeah.
So, I don't know a lot about this band other than I do think that it was a real, musical and sort of life accomplishment when there was one day, and this is a while back, but not too long ago. I would probably say it was probably 10 years ago. We were coming out of the Trans Am concert in downtown Pontiac at this place called the Crowfoot. I had said, I really like this band. You knew who they were. I was pretty dug into them, but it was more of a, I think it was more of a, I wanted to see them and pulled you along kind of a deal. And we watched Trans Am for the first time. Actually, we ended up seeing them 2 nights in a row, which is a whole nother story. It goes along with this like insane weekend that you and I had. But we were walking out of the Trans Am show, and I remember that you were kind of proud of me. You were like, this is great that you've gotten into this band. And they're very unique, and they have some very unique approaches and sounds. And I remember you saying, specifically, this, we were like walking on the street, getting back in the car. It was like, all right, Toph, I think you're now ready for King Crimson based on what we just, if this is the kind of stuff you're getting into, you're ready. And I wasn't sure when you were going to be ready and all that. It was this thing. I think you had just kind of waited for the right moment to say, I think you're ready for me to introduce you to some stuff. And that was kind of cool. It was like, all right, I suppose, Nubs now thinks I'm appropriately, seasoned to the point where, he can now download this King Crimson knowledge onto me, And I think you gave me some stuff in the meantime. But quite honestly, I don't think I had actually listened to Red start to finish until getting ready for this episode. So I know that you had kind of said, yeah, here's some stuff to check out. Here's some stuff to check out. But I really hadn't kind of given it a full on chance until now. So while I'm glad I through showing interest in Trans Am and some other bands that, and there are many, right, that were properly influenced by these guys, I never really kind of dug into it or even listened to a full album from the band until this one. So I don't know. We'll see. Maybe this is a seal breaker. Maybe this is a way to continue to be into these guys and explore more about these guys. But that's kind of what I recall about King Crimson. Obviously, not a hugely in-depth history with the band, but that's probably the biggest thing that comes to mind within the last. Obviously, you listen to these guys very early and have so in a very sort of ongoing way. So I'm a little bit more of a newbie, but there was a day where I suppose I got enough of your musical approval where I was ready for King Crimson. So that's always what I kind of remember. So
that's what most people are really seeking, my musical approval.
Yeah. Well, you just want to make sure I was ready. That's all. You're just being a good big brother, really, more so than anything. So, so what do you got, Nub, on the King Crimson Wonder story?
For me, it's I got into them in high school, and it's a result of the other bands you get into. If you really start getting into prog rock, and I was obsessed with Genesis and Yes, that kind of third leg of the stool is King Crimson. It's just a band you hear about a ton. You watch any documentary on Yes and Genesis, you read any books on it, you're going to hear the words King Crimson. But I hadn't really got into them yet by maybe my sophomore year in high school. It was kind of a band I'd heard of, but they weren't really active in any mainstream way at that time. It turns out they were active, but it wasn't in a way that was easy to get into. Right. And so I took the plunge by really the same way I got into both Genesis and Yes, which is a lost art, but it's going to the record store, thumbing through their CDs and just picking one and buying it and saying, oh, I'll try this one. Right. So if you thumb through, you just look at the cover for Red. I mean, really, it's just a rather unappetizing photo of these three guys, right? But I was so into Yes at this point that I recognized Bill Bruford. And I was like, oh, this has Bill Bruford on it. And it's called Red. Cool, I'll buy this one. So this actually was the first King Crimson album I bought and heard, even before In the Court of the Crimson King and everything else. And so you can imagine, sort of throwing this one in the old player and hearing those first few notes and being like, oh, this is different from Yes and Genesis. But it is a good intro album just because it's so unique. And if you like the creativity behind it, you'll like a lot of things about Crimson. So this album it serves that purpose just for my King Crimson history. And then that went into, an obsession with the band. I was able to first see them in 2000. My buddy Oliver and I, who I've mentioned on the podcast before, and during the Typo Negative episode, we hopped in the car and drove from Columbus, Ohio to Cleveland, Ohio, just to see King Crimson. And that's a big deal. And it's because they weren't touring much. I mean, they did like a 6-city tour, and Cleveland, Ohio was one of the places they hit. And we were just completely enthralled. I mean, Fripp became our guy, kind of our musical god that we sort of worshipped at the throne of, just to figure out what in the hell he was doing over there as he sat in his chair and looked down and fiddled with all of his little trinkets and made these amazing sounds.
If he wasn't a progressive rock and roll, icon, which, clearly he is, if he wasn't doing that, you would probably think that maybe he was like a chief financial officer for right. A major corporation type of a thing. But it's cracked me up about Fripp is he was able to capture such a complex and sort of zany in a lot of ways, not Zappa type, but, definitely off left of center approach to music. But always just kind of, even back in the day, always just kind of looked like a sort of buttoned up guy, almost looked like a businessman. It was always interesting.
He's the ultimate anti-rock star in every way. Yeah. In some ways, he's an anti-rock musician. He was out to destroy rock music a lot more than he was out to solidify it. And that's one of the things that gave Crimson longevity. It's also one of the things that kind of allowed them not to really flirt too hard with the mainstream, right? I mean, this is a band that never really touched mainstream success in any way. But with all that being said, I mean, Red did hit number 66 on the Billboard 200 when it was released. So, I mean, it was on the charts. It charted. You got to give it that. But really, it's the retrospect of Red that's achieved this sort of glorious, right, like heralding. Q Magazine called it one of the 50 heaviest albums of all time. Rolling Stone had it on its top 25 progressive rock albums of all time. I think it was in the top 10 of that particular list. It's been on a lot of Critics' Choice lists in time, but I think probably nothing more than Kurt Cobain citing it as a huge influence gave it the street cred that Red now has. I mean, that was a big deal when Kurt Cobain talked a lot about Red and what it meant to him as an artist and as a songwriter and as a musician, which is fascinating because Kurt Cobain's music sounds nothing like King Crimson's Red in so many ways, but clearly the darkness of it sort of seemed to have sort of a impact on him. And that was a monumental endorsement of this album for Kurt Cobain in his short life to cite it as a chief influence was a really big deal.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't really cite out, besides the Beatles, he didn't really cite out a lot of non-punk, non-underground type groups. So yeah, that is interesting. And that, you know, especially at that time, quite a bit of street cred at that time coming from Kirk. That's an interesting thing that he would cite them out. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Agreed. And it definitely created a higher level of intrigue around this album, as if it really needed it, because this was already sort of a darling in prog rock circles, even just a couple years after its release. So it's got quite the legacy. 5 tracks, less than 40 minutes, T. I think we can make it on analyzing this album as we get into dropping the needle on Red. T, drop that needle.
When the drum beats go like this.
All right, one thing you could say about Red, T, it don't mess around at the start. You drop the needle and boom, title track, hit it. Pretty minimal stuff there. Later in the song, you hear David Cross's violin, which adds a nice little, almost pretty compliment to this really sort of foreboding instrumental. But T, just a few things. I mean, first of all, the album starts with an instrumental, which is undoubtedly really cool, right? Again, not looking for mainstream success here, but it certainly gives it a character. And you've got 3 guys kind of doing what they do. Obviously, Wetton's bass cuts through the mix rather well, and you get that signature high-pitched snare drum sound from Bruford. You know, Fripp's guitar and that kind of now legendary riff. I mean, this is a song that has become really held on a pedestal when it comes to instrumentals. Again, Rolling Stone magazine, and what the hell do we care what they said, but they did have it number 87 in the 100 greatest guitar songs. And Pop Matters had it ranked as the 20th best progressive rock song of all time. It's simple, but then incredibly not simple, right? So tell us a little about Red, especially from a guitar player perspective. I mean, what is going on here with this riff and what Fripp is doing?
Well, what's interesting is just this very sort of dissonant, guitar work. I mean, these are not basic, minor or major chords being played, right? This is pushing the instrument, to produce sounds that are intentionally unique, and provide an intentional odd sound. I think that's when you're really pushing the guitar as an instrument with 6 strings and a neck, but within, to your point, a very simple song structure. And I think that's when prog is at its best, when it's not muddy for the sake of being muddy, and it's not overly complicated just to try and be smart or appear like something that everyone else doesn't, or all those things can begin to happen, I think, with any art form that can get a little bit ahead of itself. And certainly progressive rock in the 70s is no exception to this. But yeah, it's a classic. It's 3 guys that know what they're doing. I mean, there's a lot of moments on this record that even if you don't love everything they're doing as far as the approaches or the chord structures or the rhythmic structures, or whether some of it's in your, tasteful to your ear, or understandable or too difficult to understand for you to really have the patience to try. I mean, all those things are very valid with any King Crimson listener, but you can't deny that it's three guys that, you know, are very professional. They know what they're doing. They know how to execute at their instrument. And in this case, I think it's pretty clear that they know how to execute as a trio. And Red's a really, I think, good example of all those things coming together in the right fashion. Great way to kick this off.
It's one of the more focused songs in the band's catalog. A lot of that is Fripp brought it in as a completed piece. The King Crimson, you know, famously was in the world of improvisation and, you know, trying different things, but this was sort of delivered to the band from Fripp. Yeah, unique song in the catalog, and as we pointed out, I mean, one that's certainly held up in a lot of circles, and one that the band has reworked live and found a way to live on, just like a couple of the other moments on Red for sure. That transitions into, you know, Crimson wasn't exactly, you know, prolific at just writing like songs, but I think the next track is sort of an attempt at a little bit more of a verse chorus sort of deal, and that is Fallen Angel. I want to get your take on kind of the role of vocals on Red. I guess first and foremost, I mean, we talked about some of the other vocalists that were in King Crimson, Greg Lake, Adrian Belew. Do you recognize John Wetton's voice from something else that came out years later that was incredibly commercial? Do you recognize the voice and what band it is?
I didn't really think about that. Was he in Asia?
Yes.
Oh,
he's the lead singer of Asia. Good call. Yeah. So, and a lot of people just don't make the connection, but the guy who sang on the weird mid-70s albums for King Crimson is also the guy who sang Heat of the Moment. Yeah.
I mean, I knew that they were kind of a super group, right? But okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't know who was singing there until you mentioned it. Yeah, it's a great vocal, you know. I think listen, these guys, if they wanted to, could have done stuff like this and made albums in their sleep, you know. I mean,
clearly Wetton wanted to. I mean, you don't join Asia unless you're looking for a payday, you know.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, look at that Asia album. I mean, you know, you've got, you know, cuts on there that, I mean, clearly, you know, had a knack vocally and had a knack for producing some good melody and all those type of things. But it's always a little bit of what's kind of interesting about this band. I mean, they really are a true study. But Fallen Angel's an example of something that they probably could have done a lot more if they wanted to. I don't know if it bored Fripp. I don't know if it didn't go along with kind of the mission. I feel like King Crimson in his mind had a very distinct mission. And to your earlier point, maybe it was anti-rock star, maybe it was push the boundaries. And if you ever think you're settling into something that's too in the middle or too mainstream, that means you're not pushing hard enough. I mean, obviously there's a lot of artistry going on here, as there was with a lot of other prog stuff, but certainly it was important to him as sort of the ringleader, you know, to really make it stand for something artistically. And if I had to guess, it sure seems like what was important to him was, no matter who's in the group, to make sure that it's always kind of reaching for the next area where it can be interesting or innovative or sometimes complex for the sake of it, or whatever it might be. So it's an interesting song in that it's probably I would think it's as simple, correct me if I'm wrong, and sort of digestible as you'll hear them get. It's interesting to think if they went in a direction like a Yes or a Genesis or whoever it might be, sort of throughout the late 70s, early 80s, of something that strove to not be so afraid to kind of be more middle or mainstream or digestible and acceptable to a more casual listener. This is kind of probably more of the stuff that you'd hear. And I like it. I think it's good. I don't know if it's definitive King Crimson in the views of most fans and most who kind of really like to study the group in depth, but I like it.
It is funny to me that here we are talking about how sort of commercial Fallen Angel is, but just choose any part of the last minute, Maestro, if you can, and just play a few seconds of it. Because yes, the song follows some traditional forms early, but then things go completely bonkers in the outro, as often happens, not just on Red, but in King Crimson's entire catalog. But you've got flailing oboes and really dissonant guitar stuff going on, and just spin a little bit of that just so we can prove that this song is not right for top 40 radio. But it's funny because Fripp will probably tell you, oh, that's a hook, and when Wetton's singing the Fallen Angel, that's a hook. Well, I mean, not really,
Yeah.
But here we're sitting here talking like it's, like Belinda Carlisle could have done a cover of it, and not so much, But speaking of cover, you'll find some tremendous covers of track 3, particularly out of the metal world. So, different genres being touched on in Red. I think that's one of the appeals of the album. And certainly I think the metalheads really get into one more Red Nightmare. And then, of course, here comes the weird middle section, some sort of atmosphere to it. But the opening riff is, do, 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 do. I don't know if it's drop D, T, or what the tuning is, but it's very metal inspired for sure. And then you get all this crazy in the middle. But I don't know, man. Just with all the things going on musically, just, again, Wetton's voice just stands out to me. I just think it's so strong. It's such a muscular vocal, I just love it.
Yeah, I like the vocal too. I think it's a little bit of a continuation of the previous in that way. Yeah, would have been interesting to, see these three guys as a unit had it sort of progressed into something that had longevity, and if Wetton could have continued to kind of because I think Bruford would have done whatever. I mean, I think his career with Yes showed that he was willing to, maintain relevancy beyond. I mean, he was very artistic, amazing drummer, obviously, but I don't think he was married to Prog, especially as, the 80s rolled in and there were different percussive sounds being made. I mean, you and I used to watch that Yes Laserdisc religiously growing up, which was kind of the history of Yes. And it takes you through that whole Union tour where Bruford was spending most of his time on that tour playing a lot of electric drum pods and setups. And he didn't mind it. It wasn't like, oh gosh, I got to go sit here. I mean, he was kind of digging this, what can be created out of this, out of using pads and using triggers and some of these different things to complement the acoustic drums. So, he was always, I think, he was always experimental, but not in a elitist kind of, it has to be this or this type of a way. He was never afraid to kind of put on a show or change with the times. Wetton clearly, and we mentioned earlier with the Asia project, wasn't afraid to. It seems like Fripp was probably always the one that sort of laid down the gauntlet as far as, making sure that this project in particular, which is his baby, certainly maintained, whatever this, I guess anti-commercial credibility that was always important to him. And hey, that's okay. And clearly I think it's maintained as a kind of crucial identity of all the work that's been done under this moniker, and certainly with him as, like I said earlier, the ringleader of it. But yeah, I think another example here of kind of what this trio could have been had it been something a little bit more sort of long-term with these three guys. And I think there would have been some interesting stuff to come of it.
First of all, amazing recollection of the Yes Years laser disc.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times did I watch that? Yes, it's true. When all of our friends were watching, Saved by the Bell, we were watching the Yes Years documentary on Laserdiscs.
Well, I loved Saved by the Bell. I mean, let's not
right. Yeah.
Still watch that.
Exactly. Actually, when Bruford rejoined King Crimson for the 80s lineup, which he was there for all those great albums in the 80s, he was only playing electric drums. He was playing the Simmons drum pads at that time. So this, you're right. These are all artists, right? Gosh, if there's one kind of like commercial guy in this group right now, it's Wetton. Clearly, I mean, he wanted to go on and do some other things, but I mean, true artists, real musicians. These are not, guys who are out there to just get chicks. I mean, these were guys who really were in the art of music. I don't even know if King Crimson were into chicks. You know what? They good thing they weren't into chicks, because no chick would ever go to a King Crimson show. It's just all dudes.
I don't think Robert Fripp had like groupies lined up backstage after the shows, if I had to guess. I mean, I could be wrong, but
just like a couple rocket scientists who want to talk to him about splitting the atom. That would be like his version of a groupie,
Yeah.
All right. The aforementioned really commercial, real hit making potential.
Oh, no question.
With the fourth of fifth track, which would be Providence.
That was the poppiest part of the song.
That was the hook. That was the hook.
Yeah, that actually was.
So improv, a huge part of King Crimson's whole identity. The previous album, Starless and Bible Black, was born out of improvisation. This is one track that was as well. As you can hear, a lot of the elements there were improv'd during a live performance and then, spliced together, reproduced. It's the beginning of this thing called Frippertronics, which Robert Fripp would go on to trademark, which is this looping system that he created with his guitars. And he would make entire albums of Frippertronics, the most legendary of which were with Brian Eno, the Fripp and Eno collaborations. So I think here he's trying to just sort of put onto the table some of his Frippertronic work. And you got Bruford just kind of doing his jazz thing in the background, and Wetton just sort of all over the place. I think John Wetton's a really terrific bass player, but he's kind of all over the place doing what he's doing. And near the end of the track, it does sort of lock into a little bit more of a groove sort of thing, but yeah, it's just kind of all over the place. So what do you think of Providence, T, in all of its commercial sensationalism?
I mean, I don't get it. I guess maybe there's a greater improvisational spirit to this that I'm not smart enough to understand. But look, all these guys were very jazz influenced. You mentioned Bruford, and I'm sure Fripp had plenty of that. And the idea of recording improv onto tape was sort of a jazz move, and one that I think in many cases, was appropriate and captured the spirit of a lot of artists. But, in this case, when you've got, this progressive rock band, I don't know that I want a full 8-minute track of improv. Live is one thing. And, I love improvisation. I'm a huge fan of Humphreys McGee and of Fish and Widespread Panic and these. I love those bands, and seeing them live and even in the studio, having some improvisational sections can be really cool. But to just put together this full track of noise is, I just don't understand. I don't see where these are very talented dudes, but I don't see where talent is being applied to what's being heard on Providence. I really don't,
I think, it kicks off side 2. You think it maybe is there just for those who maybe sparked one up as they were flipping the side of the record and dropping the needle on side 2. You think it could be for that, for those audience members?
Well, it could be, but shoot, the first 3 tracks work just fine for that.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. I don't know how much of it's making a statement by having it take up a pretty decent part of this very short record. Or if they really thought they had produced something special and unique musically during this improv session. But, you get guys that are this talented. I would think that you could, if you really wanted to do something improvisational, at least put some structure behind it or put a foundation underneath it. This just doesn't seem to capture any of that to me. Am I missing something on Providence? I mean, you're the Prog guy. Is there something I'm overlooking here?
I would never say overlooking. I mean, each person would interpret a piece like Providence differently. I think for me, it's just within the context of the album. I think it's an intriguing start to a side 2, and it sets up this just incredibly loved track from the band, which is Starless, the closer. So I think that, and I think one of the beauties of the way we analyze albums is you're really just looking at the collective. What role does Providence have on the album? Well, it reveals the improv side of King Crimson,
sure,
which is a really important aspect to the band. I mean, it really is. It was always a significant part of their writing process and the construction of what they did. And if you saw them live, so, you got to love the band to appreciate a song like Providence. I mean, I wasn't sort of driving around with my girlfriend in 1998 listening to Providence, trying to impress her. You know what I mean? But if I was in a nerdy,
that'd be a keeper though if it worked. I mean, yes, that would,
it definitely would. But if I was sitting around, doing sort of a listening session with other prog nerds, that there'd be a lot of ways to explore Providence and just
like
think about
how though, like what would you hear in that? Because to me, it just sounds like 3 people just doing whatever they feel like doing in silos. Like what?
And you're hitting on some of the elements of jazz. I mean, remember, Bruford, jazz musician.
Yeah.
I think it depends on your instrument, and I do think it's probably for musicians than anything else. And my instrument is I'm a percussionist, and so what I'm listening for there is what Bruford's doing on the drums, and it's pretty impressive. The stuff he's doing with his left hand on the rim of the snare drum, and the way he's kind of switching on a dime and just rhythmically tapping into some of his free form is worth listening to me. Listening to the sounds that Fripp is making as a guitarist is like, whoa, like how is he even doing that? With one guitar and a bunch of effects. And then, like I said, Wetton's sort of noodling on bass. It's a really, really strong bass tone. I don't know if he's playing Rickenbackers at that time, but it almost sounds like one. But I mean, it's just cool. It's like, listen to him go up and down the ladder and play sort of frantically. So, that's how I would interpret it, is looking at each player, what they're doing. It's the same way you would listen to jazz music.
Yeah. And all that, I mean, that all makes total sense. But in jazz, it's more solo based. It's kind of like, and in that case, with what you just said, I almost wish they would have had it be more of a spotlight piece where it's like, okay, like the other guys are going to hold something down, even if it's frantic, something, so Bruford can do his thing. And then Fripp can do his thing. I mean, that's even improv jazz typically has an element of that. This just is a little bit too like nothing is leveled off or sort of tiered. It's just all coming at you at once at sort of the same volume and at sort of the same level of frequency, where there isn't really anybody sort of laying off so that the other is featured. I mean, that's where I think jazz, improv, and really these guys showing off, because to your point, there is some good stuff going on, but it's just sort of all in this hodgepodge coming at you at once. And I think that's what makes it tricky for, somebody like me to try and figure out. But hey, we just spent more time talking about Providence than we did the others, and I'm sure we could sit here and talk about it for another half hour. So I don't know, maybe they're doing exactly what they want.
You kind of just got onto something with that statement right there. And I will also say to you, I mean, let's appreciate the fact that in 1974 on an album that came out on two of the most major labels that you can get in the mid 1970s, had this on it. You know, we talked earlier, this album charted. It charted. I mean, that's incredible. Like, that would not happen in 2020. It would not happen in 1995, right? So appreciate for the time that there was a golden era in music, especially the mid 70s prog area, where you could do things like this and get away with it. And Island Records and, you know, Atlantic Records and Polydor Records and these, you know, labels that put out some of these really, you know, legendary works of prog rock, they would put it out and people would listen to it. I mean, that says a lot, you know? I think if you did a poll right now of King Crimson fans, their top 10 Crimson songs, you know, my hypothesis without question would be that in the top 5 would be track 5 from Red, which is the ever so cherished Starless. John Wetton is so proud of Starless. You can hear some interviews and you could tell he had a strong role in the song, but it's definitely a group song. I mean, each guy brought some elements to the table. And, you know, it's one of those prog epics. You know, it starts out with the Mellotron. In fact, he hit us with the very, very beginning, good maestro that you are. I just want people to hear that Mellotron to start because it's such a signature part of the Crimson sound and it's a, you know, significant part of the song. So it's just, you know, that Mellotron. And remember, Mellotron it was one of the early forms of synthesizers. That's tape that's playing. You know, Mellotron actually is a tape machine more than it is a synthesizer or keyboard as we know it today. So, you know, creates that mood and then there's tons of dynamics, you know, it gets heavy in spots and then it's got this breakdown and, you know, Wetton's vocals really strong. The band has reworked it, in fact, for their, you know, 2018 to 2019 tour, which has not one, not two, but 3 drum set players. 3 drum set players in the new King Crimson, including Gavin Harrison from Porcupine Tree. You've got a reworking of Starless that, by all accounts of people who went to that show, is sort of the pinnacle of the set. And, you know, it sort of explodes at the end in this madness of oboe and string instruments and saxophones and all sorts of cool stuff. But in essence, it does have a really nice melody. And I think that's what Wetton always celebrated about it. So Starless seems to put everything together to bring Red to a close, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of bass line that drives the back half of the song and has that sax solo over it. And I think this is the one where you hear a lot of the influences, if that is a word, you know, of this band. And a lot of people, myself included at times, you know, you probably think that you're hearing something really innovative. Frankly, you're hearing a lot of stuff that when you kind of dig into these guys' work, you know, kind of had been done in a way. It wasn't that people ever, I think, ripped them off or anything as much as it was, I think in a lot of ways saw a great opportunity to incorporate a lot of the things that they had heard in sort of unique sounds that help shape their creativity and help shape, you know, them wanting to take some unique and different left of center approaches. And you get a lot of that when you kind of dig into a track like Starless or go further into King Crimson's work, where you realize that a lot of people out there in one way or another, maybe not influenced by everything they did or influenced by everything they tried to throw out there, but certainly one element or another that these guys did in many cases that hadn't been done before, you know, kind of has lived on in a lot of ways influentially. And I think Starless is a probably sort of pinnacle example from these guys of a track where you can pull apart a lot of different things going on here that you've heard continue on through now a matter of decades, that a lot of different rock bands or bands with a prog edge or bands with a kind of unique instrumentational type of an edge have taken, where you can tell very distinctly where they either got some of those ideas or at the least were very influenced by some of those ideas. And in that way, it makes for a pretty important track on Red. And I agree with you, kind of a fitting and appropriate way here at 12 and a half minutes to kind of wrap this one up.
If you're ever interested in hearing, upwards of 15 different live versions of Starless, I'm holding in my hand. We referenced this in a previous episode. This is called The Road to Red. This is a 20-disc box set of the album Red, and it contains a variety of shows from the 1974 tour. And earlier I referenced the press release that I was reading. This is one of those artifacts that you pay $200 for that came with the box set, which is a replica of the press release. And the press release calls out Starless. It uses the words sumptuously embossed rhythms and beats abound throughout Starless. So there you go. Sumptuously. We'll have to look up what that means. But The Road to Red is one of these crazy box sets that tells the full story. And if you want to hear Starless, 15 different ways live, you could pick it up at your local retailer for, some ungodly amount of money. So go forward.
Is that one that you mentioned during Round and Round, it has 30 discs?
That's the 26-disc version of In the Court of the Crimson King.
Oh, Court of Crimson King.
So they've made 6 or 7 of them now. Of course, I own all of them because I'm an addict. But this is the one for Red is The Road to Red. It's 20-disc.
So how many versions of Court of the Crimson King do you own then?
Well, I have the original vinyl press on Atlantic. I have the 40th anniversary box set, which came in all the Japanese mini LPs. And it's got the mono version and things like that. And then I've got the new box set, the 26 disc that we talked about on Round and Round. And that's got all the recordings from 1969. And then I have a single disc CD version of it as well. And so, and that doesn't even account for all the ones that I've sold through the years. I mean, I've had other editions of it that became redundant when these box sets came out. So,
yeah, I mean, I think maybe you do need your head examined at some point.
No, yeah, there's no, you think so?
Just, I don't know, just throwing it out there.
Absolutely.
I care about you, buddy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, that concludes Starless and that concludes Red. So nice and tight, T. 5 tracks. How many more do you really need, right?
Yeah, I wish some others would take a page from these guys on efficiency,
Yeah, right. Exactly. So let's get into some of our analysis, T, and let's look at, does it matter? We talked about some of the legacy aspects that Red has with certain audiences, but in your opinion, T, does King Crimson's Red matter?
Yeah, it probably does. I mean, this was these guys really were innovators. Now, whether or not you like everything they're doing, whether or not you sort of jive with everything they're doing or connect to it creatively, or they were doing a lot of things that you really hadn't heard. And it wasn't always just being complicated for the sake of it. I do think that they did that at times. And to me, that's more cheap than it is thoughtful or innovative. But you put that aside, these guys still did plenty of things that were interesting and different and demonstrating that certainly not all rock, but even not all prog rock had to be formulaic, and I think it pushed the boundaries for not just those that were looking to explore what can be done within prog rock, to continue to evolve and be more experimental. King Crimson always seemed to kind of not necessarily set the bar, but definitely push the bar on, what is achievable and what is doable. And And to your point about this thing being in the charts, I mean, what can still create a substantial interest? I mean, this thing was never going to be number one, but the fact that they were demonstrating that there was certainly a market and there was certainly an interest for music that brought a little bit more of a progressive, complicated, and in some cases unusual edge to it did matter. And this whole scene throughout most of the 70s of progressive rock is a big time arena, and not everybody's down with it and not everybody's into it, but you can't deny, even to this day, the importance of kind of what this whole, in some cases, kind of underground. It's nerdy underground. It's not like punk underground, but underground nonetheless. And how many people are a part of this scene and this genre and this sort of interesting set within rock. And in some cases, these interesting subsets, even within prog rock. But, Crimson set a lot of tones. They set a lot of standards. In some cases, they set the bar, but I think more importantly, they moved the bar and created a situation where bands probably felt a little bit more comfortable pushing those boundaries. So yeah, there's no denying that Red and probably a few other of their pieces of work were quite important. Whether you like it or not, or whether you're going to put it on in your car and jam out to it or not, this is important stuff. So what do you got, Nub?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I do think it matters. I don't think it's, I don't think that my daughter or your son are necessarily going to listen to it, although it'd be undoubtedly cool if they did. But to me, it's a few different things. It certainly echoed the prog movement as something important and something more than just, wizards and dragons and the things that kind of became stereotypes of the prog movement in the 70s. But the thing I really like about it is it proved that, art in general, but certainly music, but let's just widen the scope a little bit to just art. It's okay if it's uneasy. I think that was the key for me when I first listened to Red. As I mentioned in the Wonder Stories, it was my first King Crimson experience. It's not an easy listening. It's not the feel-good hit of the summer now. You're not like, going to drive around with the top down listening to Red. But uneasiness creates a feeling and a mood that can be really captivating. And Red is captivating. And I like that. I think that was very influential for me as a listener. And I'm going to assume for others that you kind of learn that, this is complex stuff and it's not easy and it's not super tangible, but that's what creates repetition. I've been listening to this album for years and years and years, and I still hear things in it that I never heard before. And I really appreciate that and really respect it. And so whether the expectation should be there that all have that experience is unrealistic, but certainly uneasiness in art is good. This is one of those albums you can hear the band breaking up on it. This is the last stand for King Crimson in the 1970s. And they left you with something really powerful and really memorable. And that's a good artistic statement. And so for those reasons, I think it matters, especially in the mid 70s. And look at what was about to come was this just onslaught of commercialism in rock music. And I mean that in a really positive way. I love all the stuff that I'm insinuating here in terms of some of the mid to late 70s bands that became stadium rock. I love it. But there's something about an album like Red and a band like Crimson that can come along and do what they do and have it work. And it's pretty inspiring stuff, especially as we ponder the idea of whether this could ever happen again, which I don't think it could. I think we're way past that point. So let's get to the final cut. Is Red on the turntable? Is it in the collection? Is it collecting dust, or is it in the for sale bin for UT? Tell us about it. What's your final cut?
Yeah, for me, it's collecting dust. I mean, you can't deny the importance and the influence of these guys. It's not always for me. And that doesn't mean I don't listen to it and approach it with great appreciation. But, popping in this album and going start to finish is probably not going to happen very often. I do look forward to kind of visiting and understanding some of their other work. And maybe there will be another record that by them that I am able to do so or would be wanting to do so as much. But, I have mad respect for these guys and for Fripp kind of as the ringleader and for all the things they were trying to do. I thought your take on kind of the art form piece of it is important. I don't think everything needs to be poppy and digestible and comfortable. And I think that a lot of others properly took that influence from these guys and have made it work artistically for them. But if I got to kind of give a specific rating on Red, for me, it would undoubtedly be Collecting Dust, in that I don't think it's a record that I'm going to feel the need to kind of go top to bottom on a lot. But I sure as hell am not going to put it in the for sale bin as something that is influential and something, as we touched on earlier, I think is undoubtedly important. So, Nub, I'm very interested in your final cut, certainly on this one. What do you got?
One thing I know, too, is if you put this one in the for sale bin, you're going to have a lawn full of nerds with pitchforks out there waiting to get you. So you don't want to do that. I've got Red in the collection. It's a little seasonal. It's not something that you just like wake up in the morning and say, man, I just really want to hear Red, on a beautiful summer day, top to bottom. But certainly enough of an important album to be in the collection for those who are really passionate about 1970s rock music, and certainly for anybody who's into prog. I mean, it's part of the canon of prog rock music. It really is. And there's a lot of street cred to this album. If you talk to people in prog circles and you're into Red, that says a lot. No King Crimson album is mainstream, but this one would carry a little more weight than, I'm really in the court of the Crimson King, And so for all those reasons, for me, it's in the collection. It's firmly in the collection. It's got to be there. I think, any listener who really wants to have a complete collection of 1970s rock should have this in their record collection. But aside from that, it's not a frequent enough listen to be on the turntable for me, or really probably for any other healthy human being, I would say. All right, see, let's close up shop by doing a little bit of a little song exploration here as we talk about what is in your head. In your head, in your head. All right. In your head, in your head. All right, T, 3 songs that are ringing in your... Dolores. The Dolores comeback. All right, 3 songs that are ringing in your head, T. Let's do it.
All right, sorry.
Sorry, buddy. What do you got? 3 songs ringing in your head. Let's hear them.
Well, I did the Doors thing during Round and Round, and I'm going to cite out a track specifically from that record, and that's Vertilac, because actually a live performance of that on YouTube is sort of what got me to go back and really listen to the full studio effort of Full Circle. So I got to give a shout out to Vertilac specifically. There are these great clips of a few, I don't know if they were TV performances or live performances in concert, but of the Doors, performing, these songs. And they added a couple people to their band. They had a bass player and a percussionist and kind of rounded out the sound a little bit. But there's a great version on YouTube of them playing Vertilac, and it's great. It's a really, really cool tune.
Those are actually clips from the Beat Club. That's a channel everybody should follow. I don't know if it was German or UK, but it was European. I know that. But anyway, the Beat Club was a place where bands would play and they'd record it and broadcast it.
Oh, okay.
If you go to that channel on YouTube, that's where this Doors performance is, which is, an outstanding performance, but there's lots more on that channel. People should check it out for sure.
Nice. So, I'll give a yell out to that song in particular. The second is by the great Robert Palmer. And, this is before he started like wearing suits and having like chicks dance in unison behind him and, with all their lipstick and hair slicked back and all that great stuff. Which is great stuff, don't get me wrong. But this is one of his earlier songs, Looking for Clues, a nice upbeat number. Actually, it's a really cool track. It's kind of unique if you really go back and listen to it. It's, very upbeat with kind of a basic bass guitar riff structure that's really understated and then driven by a kind of a 2-part harmony vocal throughout. And good stuff. Good stuff from Robert Palmer there on Looking for Clues. And then the third is by the great Prince. This is off the Gold Experience album, which is probably, I think Sign of the Times was his best record, but this one's close as far as either being one of my personal favorites or certainly up there with one of his best. But this is track 3, kind of a Prince rocker called Endorphin Machine, which is a nice number and a nice certainly guitar piece from the great Prince Rogers Nelson. That is what is in my head. What is in your head, New Blaze?
That's another good collection of In Your Head from UT. First for me would be Who Will Save Your Soul, the little ditty from Jewel in the 90s. I was not a Jewel fan by any means. And in fact, it took me years to really understand and appreciate this song. But it's a fantastic song. Really, the bass line is what stands out to me. That kind of little thing that's going on there.
Yeah.
And then at the end, she's really belting out, a lot of passion in the voice when she's doing that kind of last chorus at the end. So that's in there from the 90s. Also from the 90s would be the song Money Talks from AC/DC.
Yeah.
Just got a new album from Brian Johnson and Company. I haven't heard it yet. I've heard a couple of the singles and it sounds
really great. Good. Power Up, good? I think it's called. It's actually really good. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think you're going to like it.
Nice. I already miss, Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar.
Yeah.
He was just the greatest. But yeah, it's so cool that AC/DC put out another album, and that by all accounts, it's a strong effort. And then last again for the 90s would be the song Hollow by Matthew Sweet, which is on the Blue Sky on Mars album. Easily Matthew Sweet's best album, in my humble opinion. And Hollow, one of the really kind of overlooked tracks off of it, was not a single or anything, but a song that regularly rotates on the old iTunes and the old iPod.
Matthew Sweet from Omaha, Nebraska.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he's a very acclaimed, very local legend there coming out of Omaha. Yeah.
Only a KU Jayhawk grad would know that.
Yeah, I do know my Midwest plains, But,
Exactly. Well, T, thanks for joining. Thanks for powering through your little under the weatherness too to dive into this album. I think it's great that it just gave you an excuse to listen to Red. So now you got that notch on your King Crimson belt, and now we'll move you on to something else.
Well, listen, it's good. It's good to be upright for a little while and enjoyed it. And it's always interesting with these unique selections, and I certainly appreciate the selection. And it was fun to get to know. I'm not sure it's for me top to bottom, but certainly enjoyed being sort of forced in this way to kind of really sit down and get to know it and plow through it start to finish. And there's a lot of good stuff there, a lot of very interesting things. And you certainly think you already have an appreciation for what King Crimson was, whether you love everything they did or not. And this only enhanced that all in all for me. So good call, and thank you, buddy.
Glad to hear it. And episode 26 is in the books. We will be back with more fun and games and excitement on episode 27 here on Two Twins and an Album. See ya. Two Twins.
Well, that's about it. That's all we have. I hope it wasn't too disappointing. We will see you on tour. Until then, take it easy.